I felt a huge sense of relief once I broke up with my ex and moved back at home. Although I wasn't psyched about moving back in with my dad at 27 years old, I felt an immediate sense of safety, as if a massive weight was being lifted off of my chest and I could finally breathe for the first time in what felt like an eternity. I made a promise to myself that day back in March of 2017 that I would do everything in my power to heal the parts of myself that kept attracting those kinds of experiences into my life and finally discover the woman that I came here to be. As I started to feel more comfortable just being in my own energy again, I kept noticing a lot more signs and synchronicities showing up. I don't know what it was about Facebook at the time, but apparently that was how the universe wanted to speak to me back then. And I ended up scrolling past this book called The Warrior Goddess Way, probably dozens of times before I finally was like, all right, there's a reason that this book keeps showing up. I'm just going to download it. It really started to open my eyes to myself, my values, the reasons as to why I was so unhappy with my life, and just the sole fact that I was basically living my life for other people and for their opinions and their judgments, and basically just trying to fit in with everyone. Even though at that point I had become isolated from all my family and friends, I was still subconsciously making choices based out of what I thought others wanted from me or expected of me. I started to become a little bit more curious when the universe was showing me things that would keep reappearing. For instance, one of the things that I did while I was at work was listen to comedy podcasts. I was always drawn to this one specific guy on this podcast because he was always talking about his healing journey and just different life experiences that he had gone to that basically led him up to his spiritual awakening and to him becoming a healer himself. And so since I had such wonderful luck with this book, I decided, all right, universe, I'm going to trust you again, and I'm going to reach out to this guy, because at this point I'm basically aware of the fact that I have all these changes I want to make. I'm nowhere near living in alignment with the person that I wanted to be, that I said I wanted to be. Like I had shared in my previous video, I had come into the epiphany that the reason that I was in that abusive relationship with my ex was because I was basically just playing out the same dynamic that I had with my mother of constantly trying to go above and beyond to prove myself to someone that no matter what I did, they still weren't approving of me. And so it was easy for me to just be in relationships with guys that did the same thing because I thought that's just how people acted and that was just what was normal. And so our first session together was probably one of the most profound experiences of my life, because it was the first time in my entire life that anyone ever validated my feelings. He helped me to really start to uncover a lot of my childhood trauma and recognize just how much shame and guilt that I was carrying that was never mine to begin with. I was basically taught from a very young age that my existence was a burden. Every day after work, I would come home and the very first thing I would do is grab my journal, my backpack, and my yoga mat and go straight to the creek out behind my dad's house. Just sitting and reflecting and allowing stuff from my childhood to come up, all these past memories, specifically things that had happened with my mother. Just for context, my mother was very OCD, clean freak. Like, the house that we lived in was basically a museum. I wasn't allowed to touch anything or move anything. Everything needed to be in its place, even in my own bedroom. And so me taking up any sort of space or like moving things around or doing anything, most of the time I'd get yelled at. I was mostly just expected to be an extremely neutral presence, like invisible, like as invisible and quiet as possible. And so I didn't really get to have a childhood. As I was bringing up more and more stuff from my childhood, there's actually a term and it's called trauma shakes. My whole body would just be like convulsing and I'm just like crying uncontrollably. It might sound really scary for people that have been very cut off from their emotions for a long time, but it's like the most rejuvenating experience because you're releasing so much stored up trauma that your body like has to get it out. And so the physical shaking and movement of it helps break up a lot of the stagnant energy that you suppressed 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. And so when I was around 4 or 5, I was playing on the living room floor, and then I remember my mother coming over to me, and I'm sitting on the floor, and she's just standing, like, bending down over me with her finger directly in my face, just like an inch or two away, just pointing at me, and says with this, like, bone-chilling voice, "Why is there a piece of lint on my floor?" And I just look at her, and I didn't say anything because I was terrified of my mother the whole time that she was in my life, like even as an adult. But back as a child, I was terrified of her because, trigger warning, she says to me, "Get this piece of lint off of the floor before I kill you. And she didn't say it in like a nice calm tone like that either, by the way. She said it very aggressively and very loudly. That was actually a very core memory of mine from being a child. And that was just like a normal Tuesday. That was just another day in the world of little Valene. Basically, if I took up any space, if I made any noise, if I had any emotion besides absolutely neutral, my mother would find a reason to yell at me. And looking back now as an adult, I can see that she was just taking her anger out on me, which, by the way, is not okay. I'm not in any way, shape, or form saying that it's okay. But I can just see now because I was going out of my way constantly to try and just stay small, to not take up space, to not make noise, to not get in trouble, and it didn't matter. She despised my existence. She absolutely hated that I existed. As I'm like bringing this piece of trauma up and my body's shaking and I'm convulsing, although it was a very painful memory to have to relive and to feel those feelings, once I was done crying and my body stopped shaking, it's almost like hundreds of pounds of weight just fell off of my shoulders. It was the most satisfying feeling to finally look at all these scary things that happened to me as a child and to be able to just sit with my younger self and to ask her, like, what are you so afraid of? What things made you feel like you don't belong here? Like you can't take up space. I started to recognize just how much my mother and I's dynamic really affected me, not just in the abusive relationship that I was previously in, but in life in general, just in the way that I was existing as a human being. It was a lot of the reason why I was such a people pleaser and why I kept choosing relationships and people that weren't choosing me and that were just basically giving me breadcrumbs, and I was accepting those because that's ultimately what my example was and that's what I was used to. And so instead of chasing my mother for that love, I was basically trying to do it through the people that I was dating back in the day. Just to be clear, this is not a video in any way, shape, or form about me blaming my mother or my dad or anyone else from my past. This is a video about radical responsibility. It's about being able to sit with yourself, to actually look back on your previous experiences and to see how those things affected you. Because at the end of the day, how we choose to show up to life is ultimately affecting the people around us. When it comes to a family system, it is important to think about our childhood and to think about how it affected us, so that way we can move with a lot more intention as adults, and eventually, if we choose to become parents, we can also move with more intention in that area. And so I'm not blaming my parents. I already know their past. I know what their childhoods were like. I know what their parents were like. I know what their parents' were like. I'm sharing my story in hopes to help anyone else that is either currently going through or has gone through similar experiences to me, so that maybe me sharing the dots that I've connected help you to be able to connect your own dots. As I started to build a deeper practice with journaling and self-reflecting and just being outside, I really started to connect a lot more deeply with nature. I started to become more present. I just remember thinking to myself how odd it was that all these years I was actually really, really terrified of spending time alone, but then the more time I was spending outside after work every night, the more I loved being outside and the more I loved being by myself and the more I loved connecting with nature and with the present moment. And then I started to actually get back into photography finally. Like I had mentioned in my previous video, while I was going through the really tumultuous parts of that relationship, my passion for photography basically just died. When you are in an abusive environment, or when you are depressed, or basically just escaping and running away from your life, you basically fall out of love with your passions, or at least you lose touch with them. But essentially, I spent almost a year away from my own business because I was so depressed and so disconnected from myself. Moving back at home and getting back in touch with myself made me come back alive. And so picked my camera back up. I started taking a lot more photos when I was out in nature and just observing more. And then eventually I decided that, you know what, I want to take myself seriously. I want to take my business seriously. And so I decided to finally legalize my business. And so I ended up getting an LLC. I launched a bunch of sessions, and it was honestly one of the most empowering seasons of my life. It was like as if I was pigeonholed into the darkest period to then be shoved out the other side into like the most abundant period. It made me feel like I was actually making huge moves in my life. It felt like I was was finally truly showing up for myself. And then the other cool thing was that the more in touch I got with myself, the more I just naturally started to attract people back into my life. And I started hanging out with old friends again. I started hanging out with new friends and like meeting new people and going on hikes and meeting up with other photographers. It was just such an incredible time. I remember thinking by the end of that summer, like, why did I not do this sooner? Some of the things that I learned is that we are a byproduct of our environment. We cannot heal in an environment that is abusive to us. If our mental and emotional states are suffering because of the environment that we're in, because of the people that are in that environment, then we need to remove ourselves. No matter what that might look like, we have to remove ourselves in order to fully be able to heal and to connect back with ourselves again. If you are in any sort of situation right now where there is abuse going on, especially in your home, please reach out, whether it's family, friends, parents, even if you need to ask a coworker. Never ever feel ashamed of asking for help, because maybe the most unsuspecting person in your life would love to help you. You have no idea. But you cannot heal in an abusive environment, period. I also learned that the only way to truly get to know yourself is to actually spend time by yourself, away from other people, away from people's judgments, opinions, thoughts, expectations, all of it. I used to be so afraid to spend time alone, and even those first few weeks of moving back home with my dad and like sitting and just reading a book and journaling and reflecting, I was honestly terrified. The only reason I ended up living the life that I was living way back then was because of everyone else's opinions and thoughts and judgments and expectations of me. Basically, any sort of life decision, up until that point, I was always looking to other people for what they thought I should do. So if I ever had to make any sort of choice, I would ask like 50 people. And then I would be wildly confused because I'm getting all these conflicting opinions from all these different people that aren't even living my life or living in my experience. So how would they know what works best for me and what doesn't? And so that was a huge lesson for me to have to learn. I've also learned that it's extremely important to work with somebody that you really resonate with and that's just a few steps further along in the direction that you want to take your own life. Working with that healer back then was one of the best things that I did for myself. Being validated in your own experiences is one of the most liberating feelings, because when we feel unvalidated, what happens is we actually suppress the emotions that are trying to come up to be felt. And so if we're expressing ourselves to people that don't understand what we're going through and are actually trying to minimize the things that we are experiencing or feeling, that is what makes us suppress and repress things, and then we don't feel it. Back in the day, I used to be the kind of person where I would get so angry that one day I would just set off out of nowhere, and it's because I was never taught how to healthily express my emotions or to even like speak up for myself. Basically, if we don't express the things that we are suppressing, eventually they're just going to explode at the most inconvenient time. And so definitely make sure that you're reaching out and working with whoever you need. If you don't have somebody trusted in your life that you can talk to, reach out to a professional, get the help that you need. It is really, really important though to make sure that you're working with people that can really support you in where you're at on your journey.
When I initially filmed this video, I didn't really feel like there was anything important to share from this particular chapter of my life. I guess it's because the bigger moments always stuck out to me as the most monumental. But this journey is teaching me that our greatest transformations happen when we consciously choose how to spend each and every moment of our day-to-day lives, since the relationship that we have with ourselves is ultimately what determines our destiny. So I guess that leaves us with this one question. Are you willing to settle for whatever life decides to throw your way? Or are you going to transmute your pain into power by overcoming your biggest fears and becoming the best version of yourself that on some level you always knew you came here to be? Either way, the choice is yours.